Hello, my name is Simone Grange. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town School of Architecture, Planning and Geomatics. And this is my pre-recorded presentation for the AMPS Istanbul Conference on Heritages. The case of District 6, Cape Town, South Africa, heritage both tangible and intangible. This presentation and conference paper will be on the work of Lucien Lagrange Architects and Urban Planners, an architectural practice made up of Lucien Lagrange, my father, myself, Simone Lagrange, and our colleagues. And it will be about the work we did for District 6, which was the study of its heritage and the production of a heritage impact assessment document, the design of the urban design framework, and in the end, the design of some of the first houses that were constructed for District 6. District 6 was and is an area or neighborhood close to the city center of Cape Town in South Africa. It's a very, very important part of our city and part of our history as Cape Townians and South Africans because it tells the story of apartheid and it tells the story of apartheid city planning. District 6 was an area densely populated, cosmopolitan, mixed in people, with people of different races, classes, religions, cultures. It was an area that had a dense urban fabric with mixed land uses. It was pedestrian friendly. It was full of opportunity for its inhabitants. And this area presented a threat to the apartheid government. So in 1966, it was declared for whites only, and over the following 10 to 15 years, it was destroyed, demolished, and erased by the apartheid government. But the story did not end there. People protested and eventually are coming back, slowly but surely. So this is where we start. This is a picture of an aerial photograph taken in 1944 of the area at the point when in history it was fully developed architecturally and in terms of its built environment and infrastructure. The photograph on the right was taken in the 60s, 1960s, early 1960s by the photographer Kluti Breitenbach, and it shows the main street of the area, Hanover Street, sloping up the mountain. This is a photograph, an aerial photograph that was taken in 2001, once the entire area had been demolished. It already had been overgrown with foliage, although you still can see the traces of the old streets. Some redevelopment had occurred in the form of a big university campus, which you can see, and the new streets had been laid out in an attempt to erase the memories of the old street patterns. But let's start at the beginning with a brief background. Cape Town and its history begins of urban and developed and built fabric, I guess, really begins when the Europeans arrive at the Cape and arrive to stay. And that happens around the mid-17th century, when in 1652 Jan van Riebeeck comes to settle in the Cape. He represents the Dutch East India Company, and they come to establish a refreshment station at the tip of Africa, a sort of pit stop, if you like, for sailors sailing around the tip of Africa. And this is what these Europeans would have encountered. This is an illustration of the Cape in the 16th century, showing the indigenous peoples who lived at the Cape, the Khoi and the San people, who were primarily nomadic people. They also herded cattle, but they did not build buildings. When the Dutch settled and they set up this fort and gardens, one of the first things they did was to establish the beginnings of what would become the street grid of the city center, a basic gridiron pattern, which was based on the Bastide grid from Europe. In 1770, this was a street plan and a map of Cape Town that was done. showing the fort with the sea, in this case, towards the bottom of the drawing. You see the mountain on towards the top of the drawing with farmlands located around it, and you see some of the first early routes in the city. There were two very important routes that were established very early on from the city centre. Just in case you get lost looking at these diagrams, always use the shape of the castle or the fort as a way of locating yourself on the diagram. So here you see the castle, and from it emanates two main routes. The lower route becomes known as the Lowry Road or the main road. It still exists, and it is said to have been established along the route that was already there, used by the indigenous peoples of the Cape. And that route goes all the way around the slopes of the mountain to the south of the Cape Peninsula. The route towards the going upwards is what will then become Hanover Street, the main street that goes through District 6. By 1767, this is what the plan of the city of Cape Town looks like. In this instance, the sea is at the top again, and you see the castle, and you see those main routes going towards the right. Here you see the city centre developing at first up towards the slopes of Signal Hill. And once those developments are fairly full, the city develops towards the east, or rather towards the distance in this photograph or illustration. And that is the area that will become District 6. A further image, this one 1804, showing the castle and the urban development of the city centre and the farmlands to the right, which are going to become District 6. And this one then clearly shows us in 1818 the layout of the street grids and also the farmlands. The farmlands themselves were subdivided and surveyed to be grid-like. But what you can start to see is that the orientation of the grids to the right of the castle starts to change according to and to accommodate the slopes. This is important to remember because these boundaries of farmlands will eventually become subdivided and become streets and the street pattern of District 6. By the mid-1800s, this is a piece of a very famous drawing called Snow's Survey, which shows the development of Cape Town then in 1862. And here we see District 6 starting to develop quite strongly. You see Salari Road, you see Hanover Street, and you see how the farmlands have now already been subdivided and are starting to be filled. At this time, Cape Town, or the Cape Colony as it was then known, is now under British rule. Gold and diamonds have been discovered further north in the country, and there is a mass influx of prospective gold diggers and diamond diggers and people looking for opportunity coming from Europe to the Cape. Many of those people who arrive at the Cape stay at the Cape, and development of the area known as District 6 then starts to happen quite quickly. The rows of houses within District 6 are developed predominantly by speculative builders, and they develop up the urban fabric of District 6 block by block. These diagrams show the evolution from farmlands to street patterns in District 6. 1862 on the left, 1878 on the right. You see how the area starts to be established quite quickly. More roads, new roads are established. City blocks are built, one block at a time, one developer at a time, all within the same sort of idiom of the English tradition of row houses, terrace houses, street development that is quite narrow and quite tight. Block sizes that range between 40 by 40 to 60 by 60 meters. This is an illustration from 1884 showing the same thing. Again, 1926 to 1944. By 1944, as I said earlier, the area is really almost full. It is full of houses and development and churches and mosques and all the urban fabric which is to become fortified and known and entrenched as District 6. This is an aerial photograph of 1944, which really gives us a good idea of the dense urban fabric of District 6. Small city blocks, mostly made up of row houses or terrace houses. Always houses are built or buildings are built towards the edges of the city blocks. The streets are not very wide. The city blocks are not very big. It's easy to walk right through District 6 and cut across the city. It's a walkable neighborhood which is full of mixed-use development at a human scale where people live close to opportunity. By 1944, the district is densely inhabited already. By 1944, a lot of the urban fabric and built environment is already starting to be quite dilapidated. A lot of the early development in District 6 was developed without proper drainage and sewerage. So a lot of that comes in retrospectively in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And actually, the first forced removals actually happened in 1901 when the Native Land Act is passed, which forbids Black African people to own any land. And that is used as a measure to move people with the darkest skins out of District 6. Later on, some areas are redeveloped under the guise of health acts. But generally, by 1944, not much has really changed in the area. It remains an area that is very cosmopolitan. It is an area that houses people of all sorts of races, classes, cultures, religions, people that generally live in a very urban way together in general harmony. People live close to opportunity, close to places of work. Many people work in the factories close by. Many people work at the harbour, within the city centre. People are close to many schools located both within the district and around the district, also universities. And there is generally, as I say, access to opportunity and urban life. The following slides show some parts of a famous survey done by a surveyor called Tom in 1898, drawn very much in the fashion of a Nolly plan, showing the transitional spaces, porches and verandas that form the edges of most of the row houses, and then also showing the extent of the city blocks, the extent of land parcels, and the extent of built fabric. Another one showing more of the district. Towards the top of the drawing, you can see Hanover Street running at an angle, and you can show how the different orientations of the city grid encounter each other and form interestingly shaped public squares or intersections at times. This is a drawing that we produced for the Heritage Impact Assessment, which really zooms in again on a part of the area, showing Hanover Street running diagonally across towards the top, with Eckhart Street parallel to it just below, and then the differently orientated street grids emanating from those two streets. You can see an urban fabric made up predominantly of row houses, which have backyards in the middle of the city blocks. All the houses are built right onto the street edges, as I said before. And then for the HIA, we constructed this land use map from various sources, which shows the different land uses as they were in District 6 in the mid-60s, 1964 to be precise. And really this shows us that District 6 held almost all the different kinds of land uses. And this was, of course, long before the onset of modern city planning with the desire to separate out land uses and zone everything. District 6 was the antithesis of that. District 6 was where people could live close to places of work, close to places of culture like cinema, close to their places of worship, like the churches and mosques. They had easy access to hospitals and other municipal buildings, and they had easy access to green open spaces as well. Also, they had always a sense of where they were in the city because they could see the sea and they could see the mountain. These were some typical street sections and block sections that we did in order to understand the humanly scaled urban fabric of District 6. Always, most of District 6 really could be said to have had some form of transitional space between the private realm of the home or the shop or the business and the public realm of the street. These transitional spaces could be anything from a little narrow garden to a platform to what we call a stoep in South Africa, like a veranda, which could be covered or not covered at times. Sometimes there would be balconies above. There were various iterations of this throughout the district. These were some studies we did of typical block sizes and also typical parcels or land parcel sizes or plots. Generally, city blocks were made up of narrow street frontages where each plot of land that housed a row house would typically be between 4 and 6 meters wide. So you had many houses with frontages onto the streets, sometimes being 4 meters, sometimes being 5 meters. Very often corner buildings were wider and more elaborate and more celebrated. And those would quite often be apartment buildings or mixed-use buildings with shops below and housing above. This was a comparison that we did of scale, where we compared at the same scale, 320 meters by 320 meters, a piece of development of the contemporary foreshore, which still exists in the city centre, which was really developed on the Corbusian modern town planning model of skyscrapers with a very low footprints, compared to the dense, pedestrianly scaled urban fabric of District 6 on the left. This was a section that was done through Hanover Street, which really gives a very good sense of that humanly scaled, dense urban fabric. Hanover Street, the main street, was really not that wide, but still it allowed for a mix of shops and offices and housing. It allowed for public life. It was where everything happened. This was the figure ground drawing that we did of District 6, which clearly shows the wonderful street patterns and built fabric of the area. However, this was not to remain. None of this would remain. In a sense, almost none of it. Tragedy would strike, but eventually, a few decades later, so would triumph. In 1950, the South African government, which is now the Apartheid South African government, establishes a law called the Group Areas Act. And this allows the government to legally declare different neighborhoods and areas of all the cities and areas of South Africa to be for different races. No one race group was allowed to live with another. So in 1966, District 6 was finally declared a whites-only area. District 6 had long, since the turn of the century, in fact, been a blight in the landscape for the white governing ruling parties of Cape Town, because District 6 was the anathema to apartheid, right? It was an area where people got along. It was a proof that people could live together. The apartheid government needed to take this away. So in 1966, it was declared whites only. And over the course of the next 10 to 15 years, people were forcibly removed and relocated to areas within the Cape Flats, as you can see on this map. The Cape Flats is a part of Cape Town, which is flatland, sandy, windswept. And at that time, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was quite undeveloped. So people were moved to an area, coming from an area which was dense and full of urban life and urban living, They were moved to the outskirts of the city, to the periphery, to places where they would not have easy access to opportunity, to education, to healthcare, to employment. All of those things would become difficult to have access to as a result to those areas, which were ironically often named after streets and places within District 6, like Lavender Hill or Hanover Park. Those areas today remain areas that are crime-ridden, gang-ridden, full of social problems. These are some photographs of people being forcibly removed from District 6. Very, very sad. And some photographs of the demolition and destruction of the area that happened over the next few years. To eventually, this photograph from the air, taken in 2001, showing, as you can see in the center, the big university campus. This was a whites-only technical college set up by the government. And then also some housing was developed on District 6 for policemen. So this was the government building new buildings on District 6 where people had been forcibly removed from. Again, just a quick comparison, a direct comparison of what was and then what it became in the 1990s. But some things remained. The churches and mosques, most of the churches and mosques in District 6 remained and were not demolished. And they actually remained and developed as symbols of living heritage and memory of the area. To this day, worshippers and congregants of these churches and mosques return weekly to come and worship at these places of worship. People, instead of going to new mosques and churches in the areas that they were relocated to, they prefer to come back to District 6 because District 6's place is their home and District 6 is where they worship. So, talking about the 1980s, it was in the early 1980s when the area really starts to be almost completely destroyed and new development happens as I described earlier by the government. At the same time, people are trying to make their new lives on the Cape Flats, but the tragedy and the trauma that they have been through is very, very fresh. It's fresh in their memories and it is still very raw. And also, one needs to remember that the context of South Africa at this time in the mid-1980s is one of a country in turmoil. The country is burning. There are mass protests in all cities and centers in the country. People are unhappy with apartheid. People are fighting back. In a sense, this is a sort of a mild civil war that's underway. There are states of emergencies declared throughout the 1980s, and people are generally coming together in a civic and activist way. Part of that culture of protest and memory results in the writing of a musical and the staging of a musical at the Baxter by David Kramer and Talib Peterson called District 6, the musical. And this is a wonderful occasion that really starts to bring the question of District 6 to the public fore. And people come and remember the music and the culture and the romance of District 6 together. At the same time, around about 1987, the Hands Off District 6 campaign is established. This is a group of people, informed and concerned activists and intellectuals, and also a number of civic organizations from around the city come together as one group, and they form the Hands Off District 6 campaign. And this is enacted by protest marches, publications, public meetings, and also this plaque, which they put on the wall of St. Mark's Church, which is still in District 6. The idea for the campaign is that they will prevent and they will do everything they can to prevent and protest against any redevelopment of District 6 unless it is for returning people. People who are forcibly removed, being allowed and brought back to the district. Under their watch, no development will happen. And they are largely successful, and this becomes a seminal and very important campaign in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. As an emblem to that, the members of the Hands Off District 6 campaign have this plaque made, which is then cemented to the walls of St. Mark's Church. It is still there today, and St. Mark's Church, ironically and sadly, is engulfed and surrounded by the Cape Technicon, or what is now known as the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. And the plaque reads, "All who pass, remember the thousands of people who lived for generations in District 6 and were forced by law to leave their homes because of the color of their skins. Remember St. Mark's Church and the community who resisted the destruction of District 6. This was a seminal moment in the campaign against the redevelopment of District 6. And out of the Hands Off District 6 community and campaign came the establishment of the District 6 Museum, which still exists today. This is one of the early photographs of the first gatherings in the District 6 Museum. And this was a very important and unusual museum that still exists today, 30 years later. It is a living museum that talks about living heritage and intangible heritage. And it is a place for people to come together and remember together. It is a place to also come together and talk about what District 6 needs to become. These are some photographs of the museum taken around 2012 by myself. And one important aspect of the museum was this map on the floor where people who used to live in District 6 were invited to come and write and make their marks on the map, to write their memories and their names and be recorded. Around 2003, we are appointed at Lucian de Grange Architects and Urban Planners to produce a heritage impact assessment. This is after the elections of 1994, which are the first free and democratic elections in South Africa. Apartheid is now ostensibly over. And in 1994, the land of District 6, all of the land is taken over by the national government and handed back to the people of District 6, held in trust by the City of Cape Town to be redeveloped for returning claimants. As a result of that process, we are appointed to do a heritage impact assessment, which will lead to the urban design development framework and the design and construction of some of the first houses in District 6. In the making of the Heritage Impact Assessment document, we studied old photographs, which you can see now, which really talk about the urban fabric and what the built elements and urban design elements and architectural elements of District 6 were and what made it the way it was. And we really began to understand the relationship between urban design, architecture, and society and culture, and how the making and design of this district allowed for the cosmopolitan and the harmonious and safe neighborhood that District 6 really was. Despite it being quite poor and at times quite dilapidated, it still allowed for and designed for good public life. As these pictures show, we highlighted and recorded that District 6 was made up of urban design elements such as building up onto the edge of city blocks, tight, narrow street frontages, vertically proportioned doors and windows, steps and stoops, and transitional spaces on street edges, streets that always allowed for views of the sea and views of the mountain, streets that, no matter how poor and dilapidated, were still always dignified and allowed for access to opportunity and for public life. Streets that allowed for eyes on the street, for children to play in them, for safety, for variety within order. And streets like Hanover Street, which really allowed for and accommodated the celebrations and the struggles of life. This is an illustration of an annual march of minstrels, or the klopse as they're known, that would celebrate and sing and parade down Hanover Street into the city. This is an illustration of a mass funeral procession of the prominent Dr. Abdullah Abdurrahman, who was one of the early black members of the city council and who became a political activist against the growth of apartheid. This was early on in the 1940s. And then in the 1960s, this is an image of Philip Khosana, the leader of the Pan-Africanist Congress, leading a mass protest and march in 1960 through Hanover Street towards the city to protest against the injustices of apartheid. The stoep, these are some images celebrating what I think is the most important aspect of urban life in District 6. The veranda, the stoep, a place to be seen, a place to see from, a place to be contemplative, a place to talk to each other, a place to communicate in, a place that always gives dignity to what are often very small and dark and overcrowded internal spaces of the home. But triumph is reached in the early 1990s when President Nelson Mandela himself comes and hands over the newly built houses, some of the first new houses for the first claimants who returned to District 6. Very quickly, I will go through some of the urban design work that we did as part of the study. This is an old-new overlay, which shows the new street patterns over the old street patterns. Some aerial photographs that show the traces of the old street patterns. A memory map that we made based on the memory map on the floor of the museum. The official land that went into trust, held by the District 6 Beneficiary Trust, given to them by the national government for the redevelopment. And then the conceptual spatial plan we designed, which was as true to the urban design principles from the HIA as possible. One of the ideas was to always create a public space or square around churches and mosques, and also to design for and create a memorial park. Density, distribution, and massing, an aerial photograph of the area post-destruction, and then the urban design and architectural guidelines that came out of the development framework that were implemented with the first few houses. Perimeter block development, narrow street frontages, a development of street design with different street types, transitional spaces, designing for things like wind, sunlight, and views, designing for different types of transitional spaces, vertically proportioned entrances and windows with celebration of front doors. Where there would be walk-up housing, we would allow for private open spaces always. And then finally, some pictures of the first architecture that was built and designed by Lucien Grange architects and urban planners. As you can see in the houses below, a direct or perhaps indirect reinterpretation and modern interpretation using the urban design principles taken from the built fabric as displayed in the photograph above. These are drawings of the first houses and photographs. Just to locate where those pilot projects were located on the overall map. The first 100 houses, which was predominantly row houses, but also included some walk-up housing, apartments, and it was really a way to test the ideas of the urban design framework. A photograph from the air of the development as it was nearing construction completion, and then finally the triumphant and joyous return of claimants. Thank you very much. I hope this has been a good portrayal and presentation for you. which deals with the idea of cultural pasts and urban futures, the topic of this conference. Thank you.